learners, today we will study the essay What I Believe by E.M. Forster. Let us first learn something about the writer Forster. E.M. Forster is one of the most celebrated British novelists of the 20th century. In particular, his depiction of class issues struck a chord with many readers and continues to do so today. Born on January 1st of 1879, Forster was the only child in his family. E.M. Forster's father died before he was even 2, so he was raised by his mother. An inheritance from his wealthy great-aunt gave him enough income to pursue his passion of writing. Forster grew up in the house Rook's Nest in Stevenage, Hertfordshire, on which he based the setting for his novel Howards End. The area is now known as Forster Country, and nearby there is now a monument of Forster. After an unhappy conventional middle-class upbringing and public school education, Forster found the intellectual freedom of Cambridge, where he spent much of the rest of his life. Liberating. He began to question religious belief while a student there. After reading Lewis Dickinson's The Meaning of Good, which replaced God with good, an influential idea at the turn of the century, he walked down King's Parade declaring, "You shall never take away from me my meaning of good." This underpinned his humanist view that it is possible to be good without a belief in the God. His travels in Italy were another liberating experience and are reflected in 2 of his early novels, Where Angels Fear to Tread and A Room with a View. He wrote, quote, "Italy is a beautiful place where they say yes and the place where things happen." This openness contrasted with the narrow-minded attitudes of the British middle class. His well-known novels include A Passage to India and Howards End. Another early novel was The Longest Journey. This was more personal, and in it he drew on his own experiences at school and university. The main character has a club foot, a symbol for people who are different from the norm, but have the right, nevertheless, to be treated equally. Forster called himself a humanist and was president of the Cambridge Humanists from 1959 till his death. He was a vice president of the Ethical Union in the 1950s and a member of the Advisory Council of the British Humanist Association from its foundation in 1963. He wrote and spoke in favor of tolerance in many areas of life, and he vigorously opposed censorship. He was president of the National Council for Civil Liberties. Forster's open-minded and humanistic view of life is seen in his novels in their focus on human relationships and the need for tolerance, sympathy and love between individual human beings from different parts of society and different cultures. In considering our life's philosophies, it is hard to distinguish between what we accept through mere faith and what we arrive at through thought and mental discipline. And further, what happens when these 2 modes of our understanding collide? It would seem that belief and reason are mutually exclusive, that whenever they come into contact, there must be a victor and a loser, that a choice must be made about which way of understanding we choose to embrace. We struggle daily to reconcile the beliefs we choose to accept with the empirical knowledge we cannot ignore. E.M. Forster's essay, What I Believe, addresses this pervasive mental struggle. Forster's ultimate humanist goal in the essay is to find a life philosophy independent from the dogma of religion, evidenced by his opening sentences, quote, "I do not believe in belief, but this is an age of faith, and there are so many militant creeds that, in self-defense, one has to formulate a creed of one's own," unquote. He suggests that his era embraces the notion of religious faith too wholeheartedly, and he wants to develop a functional alternative. To achieve this, Forster affirms that life should be lived to create, ultimately, tolerance, good temper, and sympathy. In his attempt to reach this philosophical ideal, he highlights the inevitability of turning to belief, even in his fiercely non-religious worldview. Forster criticizes religion and the tenets it seeks to uphold. The very first sentence of the essay, "I do not believe in belief," suggests that Forster withholds his commitment to anything requiring blind faith acceptance of a rule. He feels assaulted by the militant creeds of the age of faith or religious reactions, and writes in part to defend his humanistic principles against this threat. One of the more pointed rejections of religious faith is expressed in his discussion of the principles of Christianity. The Orthodox say, "Man always has failed and always will fail to organize his own goodness, and it is presumptuous of him to try." This claim, solemn as it is, leaves me cold. I cannot believe that Christianity will ever cope with the present worldview mess. He is arguing that it is man's duty to clarify for himself his own values. This argument for intellectual independence characterizes Forster's stance on the issue of belief, leaving no doubt that he is opposed to religious faith. To Forster, faith is inevitable. Blind faith is not. He illustrates that at some level we must accept certain central axioms on faith to live our intellectual lives at all. Belief in personal relationships, the permanence of human civilization, democracy, and aristocracy of intelligentsia, etc. We do not and cannot know if these are true, but our choice of what we have faith in and to disbelieve is not necessarily blind. It reflects our understanding of how the world is and how we feel it should be. Forster and those who subscribe to his distinction between beliefs attempt to capture how the world appears and further how it should work. Forster embraces relationships, aristocracy of intelligentsia, living life as if it had no end and acting as if civilization was eternal, not because he knows these things are true, but because these satisfy his understanding of how the world must exist for a philosophically, humanistically, and personally satisfying life. Forster does not reject faith, only faith stemming from religion. The chief difference between faith in religion and faith in principles, and the reason Forster makes this seemingly splitting hairs distinction, is that the former must necessarily be blind, while the latter is informed to the extent it reflects some ideal about the human condition reached through consideration, not dogmatic acceptance. Belief and reason are not in fact mutually exclusive. In fact, they are unavoidable and can even complement each other handsomely, provided that faith is not employed as a simplistic and convenient replacement for thought, but as a mechanism for developing informed principles. E.M. Forster was also an avowed liberal humanist who believed strongly in personal relationships. Here is something comparatively solid in a world full of violence and cruelty. Not absolutely solid. We don't know what other people are like. Regarding personal relationships, he claims, for the purpose of living, one has to assume that the personality is solid and the self is an entity, and to ignore all contrary evidence. Since to ignore evidence is one of the characteristics of faith, I certainly can proclaim that I believe in personal relationships. Furthermore, he explains, the people I respect most behave as if they were immortal and as if society was eternal. Both these quotations contain an explicit abandonment of reason and an acceptance of faith. But even so, Forster carves a distinction between the religious belief he feels is reckless and the principal belief he feels is both constructive and unavoidable. Subscribing to religious dogma does not satisfy Forster's skeptical stance on faith, but holding on to considered principled beliefs like the ones above does. Ultimately, he understands that reason and belief are hopelessly intertwined and that there is a correct and constructive way to arrive at belief and an incorrect, destructive way. Given the historical context of the essay, this principle is particularly poignant. E.M. Forster also believed that personal relations were more important than patriotism. Forster argues that one should invest in personal relationships. One must be fond of people and trust them if one is not to make a mess of life. In order to do so, one must be reliable in one's relationships. Reliability, in turn, is impossible without natural warmth. Forster contrasts personal relationships with causes, which he hates. He, in an often quoted sentence, argues, "If I had to choose between betraying my country and betraying my friend, I hope I should have the guts to betray my country." Such a choice may scandalize the reader. It wouldn't have shocked Dante, though. Dante places Brutus and Cassius in the lowest circles of hell because they had chosen to betray Julius Caesar rather than their country Rome. Probably, one won't be asked to make such an agonizing choice. Still, there lies at the back of every creed something terrible and hard for which the worshipper may one day be required to suffer. And there is even a terror and hardness in this creed of personal relationships, urbane and mild though it sounds. Love and loyalty to an individual can run counter to the claims of the state, and it is therefore essential that they shouldn't let one down. They often do. He also argues, the moral of which is that I must myself be as reliable as possible, and this I try to be. But reliability isn't a matter of contract, it is a matter of the heart. In other words, reliability is impossible unless there is natural warmth. Most men possess this warmth, though they often have bad luck and get chilled. Most of them, even when they are politicians, want to keep faith. And one can, at all events, show one's own little light here, one's own poor little trembling flame, with the knowledge that it's not only the only light that is shining in the darkness, and not the only one which the darkness doesn't comprehend. Personal relations are despised today. They are regarded as bourgeois luxuries, as products of a time of fair weather which has now passed, and we are urged to get rid of them and to dedicate ourselves to some movement or cause instead. Personal value system is viewed as a relatively permanent perceptual framework which shapes and influences the general nature of an individual's behavior. Presenting particular ideas in a personal way, Forster eschews simple categorizations and conclusions and evinces instead the complexity of things, the disorder of the world, the paradoxical character of human nature. Thus, he abnormalizes the everyday and brings it to consciousness. In this essay, What I Believe, E.M. Forster talks about issues such as tolerance, personal relationships, and sympathy. He also gives his opinions on democracy, force, and violence. His impressions and expressions on great men, aristocracy, parliament, Christianity, and liberalism form the other themes of the essay. The essay begins with Forster saying that the three values that were important earlier are no longer respected or followed in this world, which is torn apart by religious and racial persecution. Values such as tolerance, good temper, and sympathy should be valued for our human race to survive in future. But the author adds that faith and belief have become a stiffening material, and he does not believe in them. He feels that the real lawgivers are Erasmus and other social reformers, and not Moses and St. Paul, Christian leaders. Forster was well aware of the brewing political issues of World War II, and his essay is in part a reaction to the philosophical confusion and gravity of the coming World War. When viewed in this light, the dissonance between belief and reason takes on new meaning. The war itself highlighted the fact that two logically derived diverging philosophies can exist, and each side may still vehemently oppose the other. In the struggle of democracy versus totalitarianism, at which Forster hints heavily, both sides had justifications for their stances. And of course, the rhetoric for each would have been particularly pervasive in 1938. The Axis powers asserted that totalitarianism provided order, cohesion, obedience, and efficiency, and the Allied powers argued democracy promoted free speech, individual liberties, creativity, and social justice. Both sides had their intellectual stances, but both possessed something further: faith that their respective cause was correct. Just as Forster sought to define a humanistic philosophy that satisfied his ideals, the two sides developed their philosophies to satisfy their preconceived faith. Forster captures it quite parallel in his extensive discussion of democracy, and maybe most revealingly demonstrates his fears in the conclusion of his essay, when he notes that one likes to say what one thinks while speech is comparatively free. It may not be free much longer. Clearly, Forster understands that the war and its ideological struggle may come at a heavy cost. But what is the importance of the philosophical dichotomy between the Allied and Axis powers and its phantom presence within the context of Forster's essay? It illustrates how belief is inexorably intertwined with reason. That is, we use reason to accommodate belief, and belief to accommodate reason. Forster in his essay was using the irony of rejecting one belief and asserting another to capture the futility of arguing, a point based largely or entirely on blind faith. This parallels the political struggle of the time. At the same time, he understands faith is inevitable and is wrestling with the implications of this reality. Faced with war and the potential losses of lives and freedom, a satisfying solution to the issue of belief versus reason seems particularly urgent. Forster says that his motto is, "Lord, I disbelieve, help thou my disbelief." He also says that he has lived in an age of faith, that period of history which is being raised everywhere, but Forster feels senseless and bloody in every sense of the word. He then talks of personal relationships and states that in a world full of violence and cruelty, relationships are the only things that have a strong foundation. He says that here too there are contradictions because psychology has shattered the ideas of a person and has shown that most of the time we don't know what we are like and we can't know what other people are like. Reliability is the only way to solve the problems of the world, and a person must be fond of people, love them, and trust them to see that their life is not a mess. Today, personal relationships are disliked. They have become a middle-class luxury, a happiness of the past, and we now try to get rid of them and try to dedicate ourselves to some movement or cause. If Forster had a choice to betray his friend or country, he would betray his country and save his friend. Forster then dwells on the theme of democracy and says that he supports it as it is better than other forms of government, and it starts from the assumption that the individual is important and believes that the civilization is made up of all types of people. It also gives opportunities to sensitive people who have a creative and imaginative nature. Religions, literature and art, as well as scientific research, are produced in a democratic state. Even ordinary people who want to live decent lives and those used to expressing themselves are given a lot of liberty in a democracy. Another merit that democracy has is that it allows criticism, and even if they are silenced, the press and the parliament bring it out in the open. The parliament is often made fun of and called as the talking shop. But Forster believes that the parliament also brings and exposes ill-mannered officials who behave they are equal to gods. Forster says that democracy deserves two cheers. His concern is also about force because the question that pops up before him is whether society really rests upon force. He feels that all creative actions, all good human relations happen when force does exist in nature. It should be an aristocracy of sensitivity, the considerate and the plucky, and not the aristocracy but in a neutral form somewhere in the background. Hero worship, according to Forster, is dangerous as people may harm themselves by following the wrong hero. He has a strong distrust in great men as they are violent and dominant of the powerful based on the rank and influence. Forster also believes that primitive tribes appear to be more civilized than the nations of today, who cheat, rob, bully and bluff, and make war without notice, and kill children and women. We are easily manipulated by desire for more, of fear that what we have will be taken away. And powerful commercial and political interests have learned to orchestrate our desires and fears in order to achieve their own purposes of profit and control. The production of our drug involves slavery, stealing, and murder, or the ecological equivalents we try to ignore the news so as not to have to face an intolerable double bind. People are shaped from birth by their cultural surroundings and by their interactions with the people closest to them. Civilization manipulates these primary relationships in such a way as to domesticate the infant, that is, so as to accustom it to life in a social structure one step removed from nature. Primitive people, in contrast, tended to see nature as intrinsically meaningful. A change is needed in our politics and morals too. Orthodox people feel that this change can be brought through Christianity, but the author feels that Christianity will solve the modern day mess as it does not help solve the spiritual appeal today. He feels that liberalism and individualism is a matter of choice and it can never be completely damaged. Even if a dictator grinds his citizens till they are all the same, he cannot melt them into a single man. This is beyond his power, and each individual views life and death differently, and therefore an individual's lifestyle is also different. Forster concludes by stating that these are the reflections of an individualist and a liberal who has found liberalism crumbling beneath him, taking comfort from the fact that people are born separately and die separately. Therefore, no dictator will be able to eradicate individualism. A number of remarks within the essay point to Forster's acute awareness of the unrest of the time. He discusses a gathering political storm, mentions the merits of democracy, allowing public criticism and avoiding hushed-up scandals, describes labor camps as a consequence of extreme governmental control, and notably ambiguously asserts, some people idealize force and pull it into the foreground and worship it. Clearly, Forster was well aware of the brewing political issues of World War II, and his essay is in part a reaction to the philosophical confusion and gravity of the coming war. Just as Forster sought to define a humanistic philosophy that satisfied his ideals, the two sides developed their philosophies to satisfy their preconceived faith. Forster captures this quiet parallel in his extensive discussion of democracy, and maybe most revealingly demonstrates his fears in the conclusion of his essay when he notes that one likes to say what one thinks while speech is comparatively free. It may not be free much longer. Clearly, Forster understands that the war and its ideological struggle may come at a heavy cost. Forster's essay raises and may implicitly answer the enduring question, can reason coexist with belief? In the essay, it becomes apparent that reason can, in fact, coexist with belief, provided that belief is founded upon and cooperative with empirical and philosophical derivations. That is, provided it is not blind faith. With this, we come to the end of this program. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.